All right, let's get started this morning. I'm Sid Freedy. This is the fourth clinic for this year. We'll be doing probably 4 more next year. The last one is sort of a repeat of some things we've done before. What we'll do is sometime during the summer there'll be an email go out to the membership kind of with a list of things we can take a look at. And we'll ask you to kind of vote on the ones that you're interested in, and we'll pick the ones that are most popular, and we'll do a course out of that and make 4 clinics for next fall and next spring, 2 in the fall and 2 in the spring. So to start out with, at the meeting last week, the 5th of February, had a short presentation on too much throw, not enough expo. Had a couple of questions about that, so I want to start off today kind of just reviewing that quickly. So if you take a look at this particular curve, if we can get Ron to join us.
Okay. All right. All right. Bye-bye.
Love you. Goodbye.
If you take this little particular curve, this particular blue line that goes straight up and down represents 50% of the physical throw of my aileron stick on my radio. And you'll see this curve's intersecting here. There's a red curve and a blue curve that kind of come across at the same place. One of those is about 60% throw and about 40% expo, and the other curve, the blue curve, is 100% throw with about, what do I have here, 75% expo. And you'll see the blue curve intersects the green curve. The green curve is a linear curve. That's what you see when you come out of the box with the radio. If you take your radio, hook it up to a servo, and have it activate a channel, you're going to get this line. It's going to be a linear line with no expo, no curve changing. So you can see that with a movement of 50% of the stick on the expo, we get about 20% of the throw. With a 50% movement of the stick on a linear, you're going to get 50% of the throw. So what does that look like? This airplane is set up so that this is my low throw, low rates, and this is high rates for kicking some 3D things. So on low rates, if I move my stick to the 50% point, I get that much deflection. And if I continue on low rates, I get additional deflection to about, I think I said 60%, perhaps 50%. So if I move my stick to the 50% point, I go to high rates, my surface doesn't move, but my extent moves. So at the 50% deflection point on my stick, I go from high rate to low rate. Nothing happens to my control surface. So what that means is I can fly around nice and comfortably on low rates, nice and smooth flying, very controlled. I can go to high rates, I can fly around nice and comfortable, nice and smooth. But if I'm on high rates and I go up high and I want to jump into a spin or something, I go to the extent, I get my maximum deflection. But as far as flying the airplane on low rates or high rates, it's very smooth, it's very controlled. So what happens at 50%, let me get that curve. Here's 50% on low rates, 50% on high rates, and this would be 50% out of the box with a linear curve. So with no expo putting in your radio, you're trying to fly the airplane with this type of a ratio. That's very, very severe. The airplane is going to be jerking around, it's uncontrollable, may be difficult to land, and also it might be something that you're going to crash on a maiden flight. So that's why it's important before you take up the first time with a new airplane to set up some expo. And for a sport airplane, for sticks or apprentices or timbers or anything like that, I'd recommend typically about 60% of the maximum throw and kick in about 40% expo on your low rate. That'll assure you that you're going to be able to fly the airplane without too much jerky motion, that you're going to maintain control, and you're going to have a controllable aircraft that you can fly, have some fun with, and then hopefully land. If you don't, and you wind up with a linear rate, you're going to get this type of motion, and I challenge you to try to control an airplane on its maiden flight when the surfaces move that much. Very, very difficult. On this particular airplane, it's set up to be able to do a lot of 3D things, so I've got a massive control surface and a very large control surface. On a smaller airplane, let's say like an apprentice, so we have the aileron is basically the second half of the wing. That's not going to be quite so severe, but it's going to be very, very jerky. So in taking a look at a new airplane or maybe reconfiguring an older airplane, start with about 60% throw and about 40% expo, and go ahead and set a high rate. Go ahead and go to 100% throw and set your expo on that one to 80% or maybe more. So again, you've got it very soft around the center when you move that stick, but when you go to the full extent of the stick, it's going to go to the full extent of the deflection. Makes a very controllable airplane, makes an airplane a lot of fun. Oftentimes when I'm flying this particular airplane, I'll kind of cruise in and get set up for a maneuver, and I'll say I'm going to pull up and I'm going to go up and do a big spin or something like that. I'll be on low rates when I do my pull and start to go vertical. And as soon as I get a vertical track and I'm stable, I'll click to high rates, and now I've got the surface control I need to go into some type of maneuver. And typically when I come out of the maneuver, I'll just stay in high rates because I know that I can control the airplane without having it jump all over the place. So just give you kind of a feeling of comfort and knowledge that you've got control over the airplane, and the airplane isn't going to get away from you. And again, this was posted on the email I sent out from the meeting we had, as well as the video. The video was sort of so-so because we didn't have a cameraman, so it was always focused on the screen, and you really couldn't see the demonstration that we did with the airplane at the meeting to look at the control surface's deflection. So today's video and today's session is about, let me get rid of this. About flying a perfect loop, which really doesn't exist. And in flying any type of a maneuver, there's really only two things involved. We fly straight lines or we fly constant radius curves. And you put those two things together and you can fly every aerobatic maneuver in the book. Straight lines, constant radius curves. Well, a loop is nothing more than a constant radius curve all the way around some center point, right? The perfect loop. And if you take a look at that and you try to fly the perfect loop by just looking at the sky and using your thumbs and trying to judge, okay, what's a perfect loop? We just kind of get something that's not really a perfect loop. And typically what happens, and if you'll imagine, this is my airplane. And I'm flying along and I want to fly a loop. Let's go this way. So the first thing we want to do is we fly the first quarter. Thinking mentally, I'm keeping that string tight around the center. I just now defined the radius of the entire loop that I want to maintain. So I talk about this being point 1, I fly to point 2. I've now defined what I'm trying to do in a loop. I'm then going to fly to point 3. I'm going to try to keep that string tight. So now I've flown the first perfect radius and the second perfect radius, and I've got 1/2 of my loop completed, and I'm halfway there to a perfect loop. Typically what's going to happen with most people, we're at this point now where we're inverted. And most people are not comfortable with being inverted, so we think, oh no, I'm inverted, I got to pull out. And you see something like this, where the top of the loop gets clipped off. I'm good here typically, because I'm going up, I'm going away from danger. I get to this point, and I'm not quite so sure where I'm at, so I bail, I come out of it. So I get more comfortable, I get to this point, and I'm doing okay. I get to this point, now I've got this one, because now I know that I'm in control of my airplane. I come down to this point and I get, oh no, I'm headed directly into the ground, high speed, I'm going to crash. Boom, I pull out. So you'll typically see the evolution of flying that loop is pretty good here, get comfortable here, start to pull out on top. Pretty good here, I've got this thing, now I'm headed to the ground, pull out on the bottom. So typically the first half of the loop for most people looks pretty decent. You know, I can kind of gauge that. Here's my radius, I'm up on top, and now I pull out, or I get almost halfway down and then I pull out. So the key is to get comfortable with your airplane, and that thinking about flying 4 points. You always fly 4 points in flying a loop. You never visualize and fly a loop. I fly to point 1, I got this. I'm vertical, I'm headed straight up, my string is tight, I've defined a radius. I fly to point 2, rather point 1, point 2. I fly to point 3, I've got my string tight, my radius is good, I'm in control. I fly to point 4, let me switch hands. I've got this, I know that now I can pull out of this thing without crashing. I'm going to pull out and try to keep that string tight and wind up where I started. So that's how we fly the perfect loop. We don't fly a perfect loop, we fly perfect quarter sections of a loop. And to think about the numbers as you're flying it. 1, 2, 3, 4, and back to 1. If you take a look and visualize in the sky that first loop, that first quarter loop, I fly up and there's my point 1. Okay, mentally I've got that locked in. I know where that's at. I fly the second quarter. There's my point 2. Okay, I feel good about that. I've got that locked in. There's my point 3. I fly my next quarter. I'm at point 4. My string is tight. My radius is good. I've got that. And now I can just very casually pull out into a nice smooth curve and come back to where I was. So if I think about, I'm going to fly from point 1 to point 2. I'm going to fly 0.2 to 0.3, I'm going to fly 0.3 to 0.4, and I'm going to return to 0.1. That gives you really control over that entire loop without having to think and visualize, I'm flying a loop. Well, I'm not really flying a loop, I'm flying quarter loops. I'm linking them together and I'm making each one a constant radius. So when you get up in the sky, visually pick up 0.1, 0.2. Before you, as soon as you get to 0.2, visually say, there's 0.3 up there, I'm going to fly to that point. When you get up to 0.3, think, there's 0.4 over there, I'm going to fly to that point. And 0.1 is back down here, I'm going to fly back to 0.1. So we're flying point to point to point to point. And that will make your loops nice, big, and fluffy. And it will also give you the confidence that you can pull out of that bottom loop and know that you've got control of the airplane without coming into the ground at high speed.
Now, what about throttle management?
We'll talk about that. That's a good point. Typically when I'm starting that loop, full power, right? Because I'm going to go vertical. I'm maintaining full power pretty much up to this point. Up to this point, what happens if I take off power? Gravity takes over, right? But I'm flying. So gravity then, full power, still on full power, I'm off the throttle completely. I kind of let my plane fly over the top. I'm still off the throttle. I'm going vertical. I don't need throttle to go vertical downhill. I get to this point, about 1/8 of the way from the bottom, I start to add throttle back in. My goal is to come back at this point to about half throttle, or the throttle I would normally have when I'm nice, casually flying across the box. So, full throttle, all the way up. I'm off the throttle. I'm at 0 throttle now. I'm just coasting with gravity. About this point, I start to put throttle back in, and when I get to this point, I'm about a half throttle, and I can just go and fly across the box at half throttle. Now, depending on the airplane and how much it kind of floats over the top, you may find that I come up to this point and I'll pull throttle about right here because I've got a lot of momentum, and it just kind of floats over the top, and I come back in here, same thing, gravity's taking over, and then add the throttle to come out level. And it kind of depends upon the airplane. This particular airplane is very floaty, so you can fly that loop and come up to the top and cut the power well before you get to the top, and just kind of cruise on past and come over. If you're doing this with a warbird, it has a high wing loading, and most people don't fly a lot of loops with warbirds because that's an invitation to disaster in itself. But if you get to this point with a warbird, this thing is like a rock. You come off the throttle, boom, it comes to the ground. So depending on the airplane and how floaty it is and how much wing loading it has, will kind of depend on how much you stay into that throttle. But at first I would advise, go ahead and keep into the throttle and fly over the top, because that will minimize the typical error of flying over the top and panicking and coming back again. If you fly over the top with power, that's going to kind of force you to complete that loop out here rather than cutting off the loop. You can always come off the power over here and make this third half a little bigger, a little fat, and come back into it, and then kind of progressively trim that off until you feel comfortable with getting that third half and then pulling that fourth half back in. Now, this particular chart on the front that starts out with is a little bit busy, but it basically takes a look at dividing it into those 4 quadrants. The first quadrant yellow, fly that first quarter loop, that defines your radius. The next quadrant blue, radius number 2, which should be the same, fly that to the top. The pink, fly it to the downhill vertical 270, and the green, come back to your regular point. And the one down below is a simplified loop with just the numbers, with all the graphics removed. If you take a look at the second page.
What's that CGT?
Oh, that's a good point. With any aerobatic maneuver, you are really judged upon the center of gravity of the plane, and that is my balance point. So I'm tracking the center of gravity in this perfect circle. You know, if perchance I come over the top and I'm something like this, my airplane probably wouldn't be that. But if my center of gravity follows that curve, I've flown the perfect circle, because the center of gravity of my plane traced that circle. All of my plane doesn't really have to follow that. I could do something kind of funky like that and still fly the perfect circle. And as far as a judge was concerned in a competition, I would have completed the perfect circle, because the heading, the pitch, has no effect on where the center of gravity of that plane is in that particular maneuver, and I'm flying the center of gravity. Much like in some cases when I'm flying a, let's say a stall turn. You go up, stall, come back down. If I have a crosswind and I'm going up and I have to pitch the plane into the wind so that the center of gravity of my airplane forms a straight line, that's exactly what the judge wants. And I hammer, and I come back down, and then I also pitch back in so that I'm fighting the wind, so that the center of gravity of the airplane draws a straight line. It draws a straight line up and down. It has nothing to do with the attitude or pitch or track of the airplane. We're following that track. If I have to adjust the plane because of wind, that's just the way it is, but I'm looking for that center of gravity of the airplane to follow that vertical line, both up and down. And that applies to every maneuver if you're flying in the wind and you're being judged against it. So another one is Emmelman. Well, Emmelman is what? Two sections of a perfect loop, right? I'm starting here, I'm flying a half circle. So for an Emmelman, same thing. Point 1, fly my quarter radius to point 2, fly my next quarter radius to point 3. I've completed the Emmelman, I roll upright and continue on. So an Emmelman is nothing more than half of that perfect loop. On the other end, if I'm flying along and I want to do the split S, I roll to invert it. In this case, here's my point 1, there's my point 2, and there's my point 3. I'm flying 2 quarter radiuses, I'm not flying a half circle. And visualizing that really helps out in being able to precisely locate yourself as far as what you're trying to do and where you're trying to position your airplane.
In scoring, is that a real important part toward you invert or turn up and down? How long you fly before you turn it?
Yeah, in scoring, if I fly this and I'm up to this point, I can fly 1 airplane length before I rotate up, and I'm good. If I come over the top and I've completed 1.1, now point 2, now point 3, if I continue to fly this more than 2 airplane lengths and roll up, I get a deduction. Depending upon how much of a straight line I draw, it depends on how much my deduction is. Same thing in coming out of any maneuver. If there's a roll or something designated at the end of the maneuver, I have basically 2 airplane lengths to fly that straight line before I complete that and wind up where I'm supposed to be, before I'm going to be penalized. So you can't delay in that maneuver. If I'm coming into a maneuver and I'm going to have a half roll and then push that, a half roll, and then I start the maneuver. If I go half roll, fly a little ways, and then start the maneuver, could well be a 0, because I've drawn too much of a straight line before I started the maneuver. But that's what you get into when you get into the actually being judged. So full loop or half loops, whether it's a split S or whether it's an Emmelman, all the same thing. You're flying quarter loops all the time. The Humpty Bump, well, let's do the half Cuban. Half Cuban is probably the most popular and the simplest turnaround at the end of the box. And here we're flying level. I do a half loop. I continue over the top, 1/8 more of a loop till I'm at a 45-degree angle, and then I fly down. Halfway down, I roll back to upright and then come out of it. But again, I'm flying quarter circle, and here I'm actually adding 1/8 of a circle because I want to get to 45, and then I come on down. The other direction is a reverse, where we start on the 45 degree. Yes.
You said that after you come out of that half Cuban, the roll is in the middle of your straight line.
The roll is in the middle of the straight line.
As compared to 2 point lengths.
So I'm my quarter loop, and 1/8 loop, so I'm pointed at 45 degrees down. I fly a line length, I roll to upright, I fly the same line length and pull out.
So it's not 2 airplane lengths.
No.
To roll.
In that particular case, that roll is identified as a maneuver in the center of the line.
Okay.
And if you take a look at this particular graph, you see that arrow is kind of partway down the line. If you were to have a roll right after the top of that little half arrow would be right at the point where you get to a 45-degree down line, and it would ask for the roll at that point. So by looking at that diagram, it will tell you where you're supposed to put that maneuver. Yes?
Does it make any difference which way you roll out, right or left?
Absolutely not.
Go out either way?
I happen to roll left most of the time, and I didn't really realize that until someone pointed out the fact that I rolled left most of the time, which is kind of unusual because most right-hand people roll right. But that's just kind of the way I learn, and that's the way I'm most comfortable with. And when I'm practicing, oftentimes I'll try to force myself to roll right, because you will get into this situation because of wind or other things where rolling right is more convenient than rolling left. And I still find it kind of difficult to go that direction because I'm not real comfortable with it, because I got used to rolling the other way. Just, they both work. The goal is to either wind up upright or inverted, and it doesn't matter how you get there. Sometimes in competition they talk about doing the roll or doing a snap roll or doing anything so that you're showing the judge the top of your airplane first. I don't know that that makes any bit of difference or not, but typically if they see the top of the airplane first, apparently they feel more comfortable that the airplane's in the right attitude. If they see the bottom of the airplane first, maybe it's like, oh, something is wrong. It's just a visual kind of thing. I don't think it really makes any difference. If the judge is really used to judging, it doesn't make any difference.
I think the airplane rolls a little easier to the left than the right because of the pull on it.
The prop is spinning to the right, and if I roll to the left, I get a little bit of a boost of the torque from the airplane to roll left, and that's why you'll find that an airplane, when you do a snap roll left or you do a snap roll right, it'll behave differently because of the torque of the engine either assisting you or working against you. And sometimes it's better to have it working against you because it slows down that snap roll. It's more controllable. Again, it's a personal preference, kind of what you get used to and how you learned it. Now, if you take a look at the last one, Humpty Bump, that involves a lot. And what is a Humpty Bump? Humpty Bump is basically you pull to a vertical line, fly up that vertical line, fly a half circle on top, come back down another vertical line, and either roll or not, and then pull a quarter circle back to level. So in a Humpty Bump, we've got a lot going on because we're starting out here. Let's get my stick. Flying that quarter radius circle, a quarter radius circle, right? I'm going to continue on until I get my altitude I want. And at this point in time, I'm going to fly a half loop.
But after your roll,
I can put it in or not, doesn't matter right now for correct. And I come down to this point, I'm going to exit, I'm going to fly a quarter loop to exit. So at this point I've got point 1 and point 2. Fly the vertical, now I'm starting all over again, point 1, point 2, and point 3. Flying down the line, I'm coming out, point 1, and I'm out, 1 and 2. So in that particular Humpty, I've got a transition here, I've got a transition here, I've got a transition here, a quarter loop at the bottom, a half loop at the top, and a quarter loop at the bottom to exit. All the same thing, all the way through, I'm flying quarter loops. And at the top, you'll find that in people trying to fly the Humpty, again, a typical problem is I come up here, I get inverted, and I either fly too far, or I get inverted, and I fly too soon, or cut too soon. The goal is, and this is one area where people lose a lot of points in competition, is I get up at the top, and I either flatten or change the radius on this curve over the top before I come down. And that actually becomes quite noticeable. Sometimes that's used as what's called a crosswalk maneuver. If I'm flying and let's say I'm too far out, I'll fly the Humpty, crossbox, come up, and in this case, I'll fly a great big half loop, making sure I make all points that come into the top. If I'm fairly close and I pull that direction, I can pull this up and I can fly a fairly short half loop to get to the position I want to be. But that half loop on top has to be symmetrical. That radius has to be constant over that half loop.
If it's a big one or a little loop, it does not
Doesn't matter.
make a
As long as you maintain
cost.
the radius, it's the same. And that's a convenient way to adjust your position across the field. If you find you're too far out, you can fly the Humpty and fly a great big loop on top and get yourself in closer. If you happen to pull it when you're too close, you can fly that top on very short and keep it close in and not crowd yourself on the deadline.
Just be aware you're gonna have somebody flying behind you. You don't mind if I fly here?
No. As long as you stay on the camera, Randy. Yes.
Do you have to start and finish the maneuver at the same altitude?
No. You used to in previous rules, but anymore no, because the issue is with the maneuver, even like a half Cuban. If I start here, I pull my radius, I can draw a long line below the path which I started and return. As long as I keep my radius the same, as long as I keep my element balanced, it doesn't matter. Because between here and here, a lot's going on. So from a judging perspective, did this radius match this radius? Did this match this radius? I can't tell. And it's unfair to try to judge somebody on that particular point. From a presentation standpoint, starting your maneuver at the same altitude and ending at your same maneuver at the same altitude, from a presentation standpoint to a judge, looks much better. And really that's the goal, is to start at a level and wind up your maneuver at the same level. It looks better, it presents better, but technically there's nothing wrong with coming out lower or higher. And in some cases, much like I talked about adjusting your depth away from you, if you have a crossbox and to change your airplane, if for some reason you create a maneuver and you're too high and you want to get back down to the baseline you started, you can go ahead and fly that line longer and come back to that altitude and level out. So that's kind of a way of adjusting yourself vertically. as well as adjusting yourself horizontally. But really, it's all in the presentation. Technically, they're all correct. There are no deductions for that. But there's also an airspace score that can be given, which is not as many points as considered, but the judge can give you a poor airspace score if he feels that you didn't utilize your airspace, if you didn't fly at the end of the boxes, or if you're too high, too low, too close in, that type of a thing. The judge can give you a subjective score about how well he thought you presented your maneuver to the judge. Any other questions, or I confused on some issues? But it really comes down to that quarter loop. Every time you're flying a curved line, break it into quarter loops, visually pick yourself a point in the sky, fly to those points, and you'll find that you smooth those things out nice and smooth. They're always under control, and you can make that attempt at making a perfect loop. In basic competition in IMAC, every basic routine has a loop in it, and people tend to think, well, that's an easy one, I just fly a loop. Well, pilots lose more points on that loop than you can imagine because of all things that can go wrong. And in pattern airplane, in the entry-level routine, there is a double loop where you fly one loop right over another loop. And in judging that, I think I've yet to give anybody a score higher than 5 out of 10, because there's just so much that could go wrong. Just so much that can go wrong. It's a very, very difficult maneuver.
When you're making an empty bump on here, is it all these turns and stuff are all supposed to be completed outside of the box? I mean, if you were saying too in, too far out, I understand that, but I know there's in the box and out of the box. You got to be outside of the box to complete your maneuver?
No, in pattern competition, you have a defined box. It's 60 degrees on any type of center, and you have to complete your maneuver inside that 60 degrees off center. Now, the farther out you fly, of course, the farther this horizontal line becomes. Yeah. And the closer in you fly, that shorter that horizontal line becomes. And you'll find
the marks are on the
Yep, that's what the marks are for.
judging.
And you'll find that the guys flying in the higher classes tend to fly out very far and very high, because in the higher classes they have lots of maneuvers that they have to do on horizontal lines and vertical lines and loops. So in order to get all those maneuvers in time and keep that maneuver inside that 60-degree box, they have to fly out here where this line is much longer so they can have time to put in all those maneuvers, which makes it more difficult because pattern planes are only 2 meters in width, their wingspan. So they tend to get very small sometimes. And it becomes the point where the pilot is used to flying it out there, and it's kind of like you have to trust your airplane. My wings are level. It feels like my wings are level. I know my wings are level. I can't see if my wings are level, but I will know when I do a pull. It's just kind of a familiarity with that fact that that's what my plane looks like. I know how it flies. I know what my position is. Even though I can't see it very well, I know what the position of the airplane is. Now for IMAC, the big gas planes, they used to have that 60-degree box. That's no longer a requirement. Oh, in pattern, if you fly a maneuver and you go outside that 60-degree box, whatever part of the maneuver existed outside that box is your point deduction. So you get 10 points per maneuver. If 50% of the maneuver was outside that 60-degree line, you lose 5 points. If 60% of it was outside that line, you lose 6 points. So even though the maneuver may have been perfect from a technical standpoint, if you're not in the box, you'll get deducted because you didn't fly inside the box. With IMAC, the box used to be that way. It no longer exists. So typically you'll fly a maneuver to this side, fly a maneuver in the center, fly a maneuver to that side.